Look at a historical standpoint too. Life never really was this easy for all of human history. We have it very easy right now. As bad as things are right now,
We still have it very easy.
The gaslighting just never stops, does it? This is probably the biggest and most damaging lie that Gen Z is constantly being told, and we're going to expose why in this video. Human history is a long-ass time. The Homo sapiens species first appeared around 300,000 years ago, and recorded human civilization began about 5,000 years ago in modern Egypt. If you're going to claim that we have it better than anyone in human history, do yourself a favor and at least research a bit of human history before making such a bold statement. This type of simple-minded thinking is rooted in a logical fallacy that everything automatically improves over time, and therefore, the modern era is always the best era to live in. But this is just flat-out false. Yes, generally speaking, things get better over time. But progress is hardly linear. It's filled with a bunch of peaks and valleys. For example, the Dark Ages came after the Roman Empire. But every credible historian would unanimously agree that life was way better in the Roman Empire. And this leads us to the topic of today's video. Modern-day Gen Z Zoomers arguably have a tougher life than people who lived during the Great Depression. I'm not sure if it's actually harder today, but you can certainly make the case that it is. It's definitely a lot closer than most people think. Now, unlike the guy in the beginning of the video, I actually did a ton of historical research to back up the claims about to make. And I've put all my sources in the video description in case you're curious to see for yourself. I'm doing this because honesty, objectivity, and historical accuracy matter. So, let's get this show on the road. Part 1. Psychological differences. Economically speaking, there's no question that people had it harder during the Great Depression, even when factoring in how bad things are today. I'll go more in detail about this a bit later. Psychologically speaking, though, I'd argue things are a lot harder today. As I was doing my research for this video, I became incredibly curious as to how people actually survived during the Great Depression. This was a time when there was virtually no safety net at all. If you live in America, you probably feel like there's not much of a safety net even now, and you're definitely not wrong. But back then, there was literally zero safety net for anyone. Children would even starve on the street if their parents lost their job. Combine this with the fact that the unemployment rate was as high as 25% back then, and you wonder, how did anyone survive? The answer is that they leaned into community a lot. According to the History Channel, churches would often organize potlucks as a way for people to share food and socialize with each other. Back then, everybody, old and young, was hit hard, and thus people understood and empathized with each other's struggles, and they did their best to help each other. You didn't have what you have today, where the asshole older generations are constantly telling you you're just lazy and need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Parents kicking out their kids or criticizing them for not being able to get a job would have been an unspeakable horror back then. Although things were undoubtedly hard, materially speaking, you at least had a society and a community that had your back and supported you. Now you have an awful piece of shit society that at best doesn't care about you, and at worst actively criticizes, demonizes, and gaslights you. Part of what has been so psychologically devastating for the mental health of Gen Z isn't just the dogshit economy they live in. It's also the insane, unrealistic pressure to be successful despite this dogshit economy. Imagine how much easier life would be for you psychologically speaking if people just empathized with your problems instead of having this insane, unrealistic pressure for you to be hyper-successful. In this aspect, Gen Z even has it worse than us millennials like myself, who came of age during the 2008 Great Recession. We went from your community and family supporting you through tough times, to your asshole boomer parents kicking you out during a financial crisis, to now with social media, constant reminders of how successful everyone else is, and your asshole boomer parents telling you that you should be like that too, but you're just lazy. Part 2. Physical and mental health. Something very dark and disturbing happened in the year 2017. For the first time in over a century, life expectancy in the United States actually went down. This just goes to show, no matter how much they gaslight you, the numbers will eventually tell the truth in the end. Now, in contrast, here's a very interesting fact about the Great Depression that still puzzles historians to this day. Did you know that despite how difficult of a time the Great Depression was, the average life expectancy in the US actually rose by 6 years in that time period? And this was just for whites. For blacks, life expectancy actually rose a stunning 8 full years, nearly a decade. Why? No one knows exactly, but there's a few compelling theories. For one, people couldn't afford cars, so there were less fatal car accidents. Also, people couldn't really afford cigarettes back then either, so smoking also went way down. But to me, the most compelling theory is this one from the History Channel itself. There's also research suggesting that during U.S. economic expansions, people smoke more, experience more stress, and get less sleep. All these factors can have a negative impact on health. This could apply not just to the Great Depression, but other economic downturns in the 20th century. This is just definitive proof of how much harder from a mental health standpoint it is for Gen Z today. Physical stress in moderate amounts is actually healthy for human beings. We evolved from our cavemen ancestors who were constantly running around, hunting, and building stuff. Mental workplace stress, on the other hand, is a relatively new, modern phenomenon. Our human condition just isn't built to handle it, and it shows in the statistics. Part 3. Inflation. If a time machine existed and you gave every Zoomer a choice to go back in time to the 1930s, every single one of them, if they had even a slight bit of savings, would take it. This Reddit thread recently blew up from a guy who tracked down his grandfather's rent in the Great Depression era. One of his grandfathers rented a 6-bedroom house for just $17 a month, which approximated to about 25% of his overall salary. The other rented a $19 a month 4-bedroom house, which only came out to about 17% of his overall salary. Compare that to today, where Gen Z has to spend well over half their total income on just rent prices alone. The overall point of this thread was that, statistically speaking, renters are literally worse off now than during the Great Depression. If you're a Zoomer today with even $100 saved up in the bank, that would pay off an entire 6 months' worth of rent if you took a time machine back to the Great Depression. If you have $200 saved up, you could pay a whole year's worth of rent. If you had $1,000 saved up, you could instantly pay off 5 full years of rent immediately. How cool would that be? If we take a look at other cost of living metrics outside of rent, it gets even worse for Gen Z. Sugar cost 59 cents for 10 pounds, vitamin D milk was 50 cents a gallon, ground coffee cost 39 cents per pound, bacon was 32 cents per pound, and eggs were 18 cents a dozen. For those who could win a place, tuition at Harvard cost $420 a year. Even if we adjust for wage differences, it's absolutely no contest. The average salary back then was $1,731 back then, meaning an average salary was enough to rent a house, pay all your own food and bills, buy a new car, and go to Harvard with absolutely no student loan debt. Raise your hand if you're a Zoomer who would take that deal. Yeah, I'm pretty sure every Zoomer just raised their hand right now. Part 4. The final verdict. So who actually has it worse? Modern-day Gen Z or people who lived through the Great Depression? I consider myself somewhat of a Gen Z defense lawyer, and my mission on this channel is to expose all these BS lies from delusional boomers who gaslight you into thinking you're just lazy and you have it better now than ever before. That being said, I'm also honest and objective, and I did a lot of thorough historical research for this video. My final unbiased verdict is that, despite everything we just discussed, I'd still have to say the Great Depression era was harder than modern-day Gen Z life today, though not by as much as you'd think, and you could certainly make an argument for either. Some of the stories I read when researching this were absolutely heart-wrenching. The fact that there was no social safety net back then meant that absolutely no one was spared if they couldn't find a job. There were massive areas of what they called Hoovervilles, homeless structures that people built with whatever scrap material they could find. The worst part of the lack of social safety net was that even innocent children weren't spared. Children starved, and as this story tells, they had to split one meatball amongst 8 children at times. There were over 200,000 vagrant children wandering the streets without parents as the Great Depression shattered their families. Young teenagers were so desperate to find work that they took the risk of just hopping on a train to try and hitch a free ride to the next city. There were no alternative life paths available to young people today, like investing in crypto, moving abroad, or becoming a YouTuber, which, although are difficult right now, were impossible and non-existent back then. I would personally say that all of this was harder than the modern-day challenges Gen Z faces, which we discussed earlier. But it's certainly at least close. But this is kind of the whole point of the video. All these delusional boomers claiming you have it better than anyone in human history just mindlessly throw out this statement without actually bothering to do even a slight bit of historical research. When I actually took the time to do some historical research, I literally had to handpick the absolute worst economic time in American history to find an era where people had it tougher than Gen Z today, and even that is very close and debatable. If you picked any other era in the 20th century, the roaring 20s, the booming post-war economy of the 60s, even the somewhat recent 90s, it's absolutely unquestionable that not only do we not have it better than anyone in human history right now, we're actually living in one of the worst times in human history, which boomers themselves created and now blame us for. Now, in this video, we've only covered American history, but we can even take this further as there's a legitimate case to be made that modern-day Gen Z even has it harder than the average medieval peasant. Check out this video right here to learn why.